You've already answered my next question, which is really that obviously you're among the rare anthropologists who insist on working with scholars in other fields, but you have been formed as an anthropologist and presumably in the UK and in Cambridge. And I was about to ask you who had influenced you most inside and outside Cambridge or the UK, and whom you admired most.
You mean in the anthropological field?
In the anthropological field. And you've already parted.
I suppose the people I work most closely with, I mean, Evans Pritchard, and my forties, Duckman, people that I work with on African topics, and the people who were writing at that time, you know, what were virtually textbooks of textbooks in anthropology. I mean, African political systems, African systems of kinship and marriage. These were the important, you know, works which were coming out, which were theoretical as well as empirical interest.
Outside the UK, I don't notice any very notable American influence in your at that time.
No, there wasn't any noticeable. There wasn't any noticeable American influence. There had been a little in getting me interested in anthropology. You know, partly arising out of the war. You know, many of us have read Ruth Benedict, Mead, Geoffrey Gora, and Gregory Bateson. And that was part of the thing that led me to have an interest in anthropology. But there was a lot of hostility over here against that. And I suppose one absorbed a good deal of that sort of hostility about references to lady novelists and talk of this kind. There were American influences. I mean, there were American scholars whose work was interesting, but they usually turned out to be people that had worked with Franklin Brown in Chicago, like Egan and Tax and people of that kind. I can't say that I got a great deal out of, a little perhaps from reading people like Julian Stewart, not much from reading Leslie White, I must say. Really didn't find that of great interest. Most of it wasn't sort of professional enough, I think, at the empirical level to warrant the speculations that were built around it.
And the French?
Well, the French, more so. I mean, you see, essentially the training in England at that time was largely Durkheimian. Essentially because of Franklin Brown, Evans Pritchard, and company. And so that, you know, I mean, I read an enormous amount of Durkheim. And I was reading the work of the Année Sociologique down to today. And, you know, a number of my colleagues, a number of my contemporaries there were doing the translations of Durkheim into English. Rodney Needham, Ian Cunnison, the volume on the gift, and so on. I mean, all these are being translated by pupils of Evans Pritchard and Fortis, Evans Pritchard read. So that a lot of that was in the air. But French anthropology was not of supreme interest at that time, apart from the new work of Lévi-Strauss. partly because it centered around these sort of field trips of Griot and company to West Africa, which many of us were rather suspicious of what was coming out of these. They were people who didn't speak the language.
Mm.
They were people who went to field sites for short periods of time and didn't really, and were prepared to talk about myth and complexities of religion and ideology without understanding the language of the people themselves, and that seemed to many of us to be a supreme insult. It's already well talking about material objects and household censuses and things like that, but to choose things like myth, you know, when you can't speak the language, and this so many of them are doing, and the work was very speculative. It turns out to be very speculative. I mean, they thought they were doing empirical work. And I think has not stood the test of time, really, much of it. But Levi-Strauss's work was coming up, and that was much more interesting on the, obviously on an intellectual level.
Not unspeculative.
Again, the fieldwork element, as many have pointed out, particularly English anthropologists, was somewhat limited. And once again was highly speculative, but he was using ideas in a more interesting way than others. I mean, French anthropology has changed a lot since then, in the 60s and 70s, and partly because of the enormous amount of funds which the French are prepared to put into things like this. Has done very well. I mean, now extremely good ethnographic work is done in France, probably better than anywhere else.
You weren't put off by the rather anti-historical approach of the classical British functionalists, which seemed to me only to be just about fraying at the edges in the early and middle 50s.
It was fraying at the edges then, but curiously, it didn't really exist for very long. I mean, it was, you know, when you think of it, it was Malinowski, of course, principally.
Radcliffe Brown?
And Radcliffe Brown in a more theoretical way, that is absolutely true. Yes. And of course it was following, you know, a long, you know, sociological tradition of separating off diachronic and synchronic studies. It was fraying at the edges then. I mean, you know, Evans Pritchard was had done his work on the Cyrenaica. Shapiro was clearly interested in historical matters. Max Blackman was, though sometimes in a rather cryptographic fashion, I think, with Max. I mean, he was, but I mean, he sometimes shifted his point of view there. No, I mean, it just seemed natural to me. I mean, you know, more or less the first paper I wrote, I think, in Ghana was on, you know, it was on the influence of Islam, the background influence of Islam coming in there. It just seemed to be natural to write about those kinds of things. So it didn't really worry me what other people were saying about this. I mean, I could see that there was a case to be made for doing a synchronic study for certain points of view. I mean, from certain points of view. But to think that it answered all the questions, or think that one could say that, you know, history was irrelevant or history was bunk, I mean, that seemed to be not worth the case, but not worth arguing.
No, indeed. Now, these are the people you admired,
yes,
who influenced you. Who were or are you against? Anthropologically,
yes,
in your field. Schools, people.
Yes, well, I suppose one was, I mean, I suppose earlier on I was against most of the people that the sort of school of British anthropology was against. I mean, There was a time when the School of British Anthropology in the early 50s was a pretty sort of close, as you know, close sort of network at the time, the association of the founding Association of Social Anthropologists and so on, when they certainly thought they had certain keys for unlocking the secrets of the universe. So, you know, one tended to look down on people trained in America, for example. In fact, even now, I think this Association of Social Anthropologists, it did broaden out to the Commonwealth, and it includes, I don't know whether this is true to this day, but I think it is, it includes people on the basis of where they were trained. At first it was only in England, then it was extended to the Commonwealth. It's never been extended to America. And Americans can join if they spend time over here. But otherwise, it's a rather exclusive club. So I suppose it wasn't true that I was against some of the kind of psychological anthropology that was taking place in the States. I was against, I think, some of the cultural personality work, because that seemed to me rather superficial. But not against others. I suppose people would say that I was, might stigmatize me as an anti-structuralist. I'm not sure that I would accept altogether that designation. I always find the works of Levi-Strauss an interesting polemical reference point, let me put it that way. I mean, worth arguing about.
Just one incidental question.
Yes.
Pology, any opinions? He has been influential in anthropology.
Yes, he has been influential in anthropology, and I did read him a lot. He had a great influence, of course, on my close friend and neighbour, Moses Finley, and many others. And during the 50s, I was influenced by Pology, yes, and I think many of us were. But I became, for intellectual reasons, I became unhappy about the kinds of radical divisions that he was making, the way he was making radical divisions in human society. I mean, I wasn't happy about the concept of the ancient economy, for example. I mean, I wasn't very happy about the concept of the ancient economy and the way that Moses expounded it. I wasn't really happy about the specifying the level of society in which reciprocity was and similar mechanisms were the only mechanisms of exchange. You know, the more I looked at Africa and the history of Africa, then I think this came out of the work of a number of historians of Africa, like Basil Davids and others, that commercial exchange was a part of the African way of life for very many years. And I thought that attempts to apply Pology theory to Dahomey, for example, were were not really very useful at all. I'm the kind of porter. There was something in that sort of porter trade notion, but it was not. I think he overgeneralized the notion. And it meant that people were not giving enough attention, I thought, to the to commercial exchanges in Africa. I mean, they accepted situations in which, as a society I went to, in which people were using extraordinary numbers of cowries, and then analysed the situation in those terms. But when you ask where these enormous amounts of cowries came from, I mean, they all came from Maldive Islands off the Indian Ocean. They came in some kind of exchange system, which was not reciprocal, I mean, which was a commercial exchange system. And that was part of the, that was part of the operational system, as I saw it, not simply the little local business of exchanging cowries up and down for chickens and goats and so on. It tied in with that. I mean, just as I was always impressed with her role. I mean, including areas adjacent to me in Africa that they played in the medieval gold trade and pushing medieval gold into Italy to enter into commercial exchanges with the West. It was that kind of networking that I was interested in, and it seemed to me that the kind of sort of cuttings off that Pology did and the people accepted at that time made it more difficult to understand and even to describe these kinds of things.
Now let's get a little bit further into your work. In your, so to speak, autobiographical statement in the annual review in Pology, it describes the key words, probably this isn't your choice, or is it? As history, Cambridge, kinship, literacy, Lodagar.
No, that was not, I hope that was not my choice. I don't think, as I recall, that I made any choice in that way.
What else would you put in, and what
I certainly would have put in, I certainly would have put in comparative studies in some way or other. I mean, now when I went to Lodagar, I was interested, as I say, in inheritance systems. It was partly because I'd read little about these in Europe before, and I was interested in how they differed and were similar to European arrangements. And I wasn't in Africa simply to look at African societies. I mean, I was interested in comparing these with European ones that I've lived in and Asian ones that I've worked in, that I had read about. So, very often the things I write sort of start off with Africa, but they spread in a sometimes rather picaresque way into other areas, because I'm interested in trying to make sense of it, make sense of this in a wider context. I mean, both, make sense of what I've read about and what I've experienced in Africa. So I think that I would add, for what it's worth, comparative studies to that, since it seems to me that's part of what I'm interested in doing.
Right. Now, the point is, it seems to me that it's not only comparative studies, but in some ways a very broad, what Perry Anderson calls a deliberately macro-evolutionary tack. As it were, what happened in history, to go back to Gordon Childe.
Well, it's quite true that Gordon Childe is really one of the important books I've read, yes.
I do have that impression.
What happened in history? You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right. What happened in history was one of the really important books for me. Yes, I mean, yes, I was interested in what happened from the Bronze Age on. That's true, and how that's quite critical. And it was critical to me because it seems to me that in Africa, talking to economists and talking to many other people, particularly trying to understand the processes of development that were taking place in Africa or were not taking place in Africa, then it came to be absolutely clear to me, and this was an important revelation out of Africa for me. It came up in the Nkrumah area, I remember, in a rather acute form. When I gave some lectures, public lectures, suggesting that African agriculture could be improved by the adoption of the plough. This was much against the policy of the improver at the time, who was intent on importing Yugoslav tractors, which rarely worked and cost a great deal. And it was the notion that people were working on at that time, and still are to a large extent, that there was a kind of third world which was all a sort of one level like that, in which one could do certain things to improve and to bring it up to, you know, standards of Western Europe and America in a relatively short space of time. And it just seemed to me that there were such enormous differences between Africa and the cultures, you know, that Child was talking about in the Bronze Age, because they were not based on, you know, on the use of the written word. They were not based on the plough. They didn't have numerous specialisms and technologies and so on, which they needed to develop. And people thought they could bring in a tractor or a plough without any knowledge, I mean, simply as an instrument, without any idea that this had a whole social organisation of production behind it, and that it could, you know, that they could change things overnight. And the one thing we've learned about Africa is that we can't change things overnight. It isn't simply a question of putting down some kind of, making some kind of technological change at that level, without seeing that technology within a much wider social system of social organisation, of productions, I say, in that way.
Yes. Yes. It seems to me you're once again anticipating the question I was about to ask, yes. Which is not at all. Which it seems to me that the axis around which a lot of your work turns, at least over things, is precisely that of the contrast between Africa and the Eurasian society.
That's right, yes,
as you think.
Yes.
And I mean, it comes out in practically all writing. It seems to me to structure in many ways.
Yes.
Let me incidentally ask one incidental question.
Yes.
Why don't you ever bring in the Americas and American societies?
Well, I know I should do, but I'm already stretching myself as much as I go. I do have American society. I am interested in them. I know a little about them. And it's just that it would require a lot more work, and I don't know quite. It obviously adds something, and they don't modify any ideas that I had. But it's not either through sort of deliberate neglect there. I mean, I am conscious of it. It's just that. But I suppose with regard to, I mean, Africa and Europe is obvious. What I want to do, I mean, what I'm interested in doing with Europe and Asia in a sense, which I'm working on my latest thing, is really connected with the opposition to Africa, and that is to see those as much more similar than many scholars have wanted to do. So I once wanted to emphasize the differences I see it between Africa and India, and then make the difference less between India and China and Europe. I mean, it has always seemed to me that Levi-Strauss's exemplification of China and parts of India and so on as elementary structures of kinship, that there must be something ultimately profoundly wrong about comparing those, except on a a very limited level with Australian systems.
Mm.
If you were doing so, then you were saying something very restricted about the notion of kinship in those contexts. You were singling out something which clearly was not linked to, was not entailed in any very close way with the society as a whole. And it was that area I wanted to see what aspects of kinship and so on were linked to the society as a whole. And I saw these as nearer to European systems than African ones.
Well, you've obviously done this in an extremely stimulating manner, not to mention the differences between Europe and some of the others. Nevertheless, what I want to ask is this. Essentially, this major axis of your work, the contrast between Africa and Asia, in the broadest sense, seems to me a sort of materialist conception of history approach. You see, after all, in the one hand you have got a certain type of agriculture and various other things which follow from it. In the other you have limited resources and so on and so on. In some ways it ties in with Gordon Child because of the agriculture, plough, literacy and so on coming in. Now, how did you get to this, and how early would you say that you really began to formulate this basic organizing principle of what is still coming out in your work, and why?
Yes. Well, obviously I see it as related to the kind of thing that you're asking me. But, I mean, in no simple way, because I'm also interested in, I also see Bronze Age civilizations as, as introducing literacy and the books we have around us and the forms of knowledge in which we're dealing with. And I see these as being absent from Africa, or except in areas where Islam entered and brought with it some of these aspects of Mediterranean culture. But it wasn't available by and large for organizing state systems and for doing a whole lot of other things, intellectual as well as others. So it's also on that level. But yes, I think it's absolutely true to say that I do see literacy. I can't see, I do see literacy, I see writing as emergent at a certain point in the development of human society. And to that extent, coming back to the point of schools that I would differ with, I mean, the relativistic tendency in anthropology, which I appreciate in certain areas, like perhaps the relativity of morals or something like that. To push that to those kind of areas and not be prepared to talk about the differences between, the important differences I see between societies with writing and without writing, or societies with systems of production that can support a literati and that can support various specialists like ourselves who are not engaged in primary productive processes. That is critical, yes. I think that would be critical to my thinking. That obviously links up with earlier things that I read of Marx and Engels. It also comes out of my experience in Africa, where I asked myself very much, what in this community. In the first place, I asked myself in this community, how could one support a school population, that kind of thing? I didn't ask it soon enough, without changes in the economic structure.
That's right.
Which would have enabled us to do this. So what happened in that fascinating period, and I wish I would spend my time writing the history of this in a general way, after the liberation of these countries, was that we put in all these universities and so on, which we thought were going to change things overnight, without asking how these were going to be supported. I mean, I'm afraid we simply didn't ask the question we should have done, given our background perhaps. We did not ask the economic questions about these, but we thought they would follow. And I mean, the one thing that's so tragic about the place now is that, you know, these institutions were built up and have now had to retract. Bureaucracies are built up, and one of the fascinating things that is going on now is that is to find the new adaptations to the possible situations in which you find school teachers and university teachers being part-time farmers, you know, farming and doing their farming work. And this is the adaptation to a situation which I suppose, you know, in the flux of interest of, you know, wanting Africa to develop and change after war. We'd hoped they would get over this phase, but they haven't. And it strikes me the more one looks at developments in Africa today, and compares that with the kind of development that's taken place in Taiwan, Hong Kong, Korea, and these kind of places. You know, where are the African Koreas? I mean, where are the African Taiwans and so on? It isn't because people haven't tried. I mean, there's been a lot of attempt. There's been a lot of attention was given to Africa at that, you know, at that time. But what we were building on at the economic level and at the level of literacy, though I must say we've had a lot more success in education than we have in other things. A lot more success, very interesting. I mean, that has been one great success, really. I mean, unfortunately, because we've educated people who are now thriving in America and elsewhere. I was in Chicago recently. I was told there were 8,000 Ghanaians in Chicago. All these the educated people. I mean, the country can't afford that sort of thing. And there's nothing there going on. I mean, what you see now in Ghana is really no different than I would, you know, than economic, or very little different than it was at the time of independence.
Of course, that raises issues which don't distinguish only Africa from the remainder of the world, but almost every relatively poor country or underdeveloped country. I mean, this drain of the educated people towards the first world.
Terrible.
However, the point, it seems to me that you do bring out very much is that as against the sort of fashion for pure relativism,
yes,
you insist and you take the view that one must insist on the difference between simple and complex, primitive and further advanced societies, whether you put them in inverted commas or not.
I mean, I insist upon a range of a range of complexity in that way, which seems to be absolutely critical for understanding what is happening now and what has happened in the past. Yes, I do see that too.
Yes, I mean, I would agree with you, and of course the thing that follows from it is obviously that it is exceedingly difficult to jump, so to speak, if you're used to one kind of your society structured in one way with a certain background, simply to transform this from one day to the next, it won't work.
It's enormously difficult. You know, I mean, I look in my rural area in Africa now, where they've got the wheel, but all the wheels are made outside. I mean, nobody knows. I mean, in every Indian village, you've got a wheelwright there, like you had out in East Anglia. He makes wheels. They know now the principle of the wheel. But they don't make wheels, so they depend on every bicycle, as far as I'm aware in Africa, maybe Nigeria's changed. Every wheel on anything has got to come in from outside. There are no little horses or bullocks or something, or anything, or donkeys or anything, pulling anything. I mean, so that you are completely dependent this way. And I mean, that is something that I read about in the Acid Wheel, but I mean, it strikes me every time I go back there how critically important this is, that the dependence of the country are outside. I mean, if they don't have these imports, if they don't have this aid from the World Bank, they go back to head loading. I mean, literally. Because there's no change in the social organisation of production which produces colours. It is true, people have tried, and people have, there's a little of it in some of the French churches where people have tried to set these things up, but they're not at the village level yet. I mean, there's still, you know, aid volunteers coming in to do this, and I mean, the more I look at that, the more I ask myself, how the hell, you know, did other societies adopt this? It must have been a great traumatic process to do, you know, for the adaptation of things like this, and to shift from, you know, one form of transport which you were set up to deal with at the village, you know, to another one. You only have people come in and prepared to live at the village level who are going to knock out your wheels and start up a smithy, you know, for dealing with this kind of thing. And we're still a long way from that long way from that in Africa.
Now, out of your sort of basic approach, you've developed, shall we say, three strands of your writings. One is the whole business about family, marriage, and, if you like, reproduction.
Yes.
Yes. The other is the one arising out of your oral literacy studies.
Yes.
And the third, if I read you rightly, is the one that you concentrated on to some extent in the 80s, which you might call cultural, if food culture and flower culture is part of the thing.
Yes.
Now, incidentally, are there any other aspects that you think here that you would like to pursue but haven't had a chance to?
Well, I was very much interested also in, you know, in not only means of modes of production and modes of communication, but also what I called modes of destruction.
That's right. I noticed this has taken a bit more of a back seat in your
Yes, it does actually. Although one time it was, I mean, it was particularly important in Africa to me that, I mean, once again, this is absolutely critical to my thinking about Africa, that when the Portuguese came round, they came round to West Africa and established their forts. I mean, they did so with the aid of cannon and handguns. And even at the early stage, there were some Portuguese who rushed off and sold handguns to to local people, to Africans, and got a good price for them. And then, of course, when the English and the Dutch broke away from the Catholic bans on selling firearms to Africans, to the infidel, they moved in and sold a great deal of Dane guns, as it's now called to this day, down in West Africa. But the Africans could never make them. They've never been able to make their guns. They can copy things, they can copy even some of the intricate the firing mechanism and so on. But it was absolutely critical to every African state was to have an outside supply of guns. Because although they had ironworking, which did come across Africa, they never had furnaces that would make steel. I mean, they could never make barrels. And I mean, I've been in places at funerals where they've been shooting off firearms at a funeral, and you know, these barrels have just burst open because somebody's put a bicycle tube instead of a gun barrel on the end of a rifle. They never knew how to do this, and yet directly the Portuguese got to Arabia, to the Malabar coast, to Japan. People had the levels of iron technology there to be able to copy the European guns. So if you were getting Malabari guns and so on, straight away, and making very important changes to politics and so on in Japan and in India. But Africa was always dependent on the import of guns, is to this day as far as I'm aware. And once again, I mean, this sort of dependence, because of because they had not developed a certain level of production and found it difficult to do. It's not because they're unintelligent or anything like that, but these are difficult things to do. I didn't invent the bicycle. I mean, I simply accepted the technology which was set up here. But this never, it was never institutionalized, it was never built up in Africa. It was very critical. It meant that all firearms had to come from outside.
The other thing that strikes me that you've,
Yes.
shall we say, got a bit less interested in recently is the whole question of state and state power, which at one time you seemed to be. And the other thing that I'm not certain that you've ever dealt very widely with in your comparative work is cities.
No, I never have done. You're absolutely right there. That's absolutely right there. Well, I did actually give some lectures once on cities in Africa. So there's a lot of that stuff. And I was interested in the nature of cities in Africa, and the agro city and so on, and the merchant city. But I never went into any systematic comparison, nor did I with state power. I mean, implicit I have. I mean, I have it in a certain way with state, with some aspects of state systems, but it's really been more to do, you mentioned the cultural interest, it's more to do with the nature of difference in class, in inverted commas, in the strata, in the relationships between strata. The differences, for example, I mean, the area that Esther and I worked in, or she mainly worked in Contra, I've written about this, and I was immensely impressed with the fact that the people were marrying everywhere. I mean, the ruling class were marrying commoners and so on. And it wasn't at all like the sort of Indian situation, or even the situation that Mark Bloch writes about for England, with people marrying in a circle, intending to marry in a circle. In fact, there were tendencies to marry outside. Rulers would marry commoners, partly because they made them beautiful, partly because they wanted ties with commoner groups. There was no cultural cuttings off in that way. I mean, there were certain differences between the high and low, but there was no cultural cuttings off in that way. The boundaries were much looser. That aspect of state systems that I've been interested in. I've thought about the others, Eric, but it's really that I've never thought of any conceptual way of comparing, for example, the different complexities of state systems that weren't sort of very obvious ones. And I think one can talk in terms of authority and so on and so forth, but it's very difficult to do comparative work in that field, I've always found. Maybe I should read Michael Mann's book, which I haven't, about power. I've never felt anything very satisfactory. When I've tried to compare this in African societies, rather simply, I've never really got very far in doing so. Never felt that they never handled it very well.
What I'm really trying to get at is something else.
Yes.
You're obviously, if you like, a sort of totalizing historical anthropologist. I mean, a sort of, you try and cover everything, all bases. Nevertheless, in fact, you find yourself in your actual work concentrating on certain strands much more than others.
Absolutely.
Now, is this in some ways because, in a sense, why is it that you have found yourself concentrating on these strands rather than on some others?
Yes.
It's
not
supposing that you're not interested in.
Well, I mean, that partly sort of, reasons of one's own personal biography. I mean, the literacy thing is pretty obvious because I worked with Ian on it, and I got interested in that because I was interested in English and so on. Stuff to do with the family, I suppose, came out of the general sort of, this is one thing that anthropologists specialise in, and one was interested in that. And the third element, which was the third element, yes. There are certain areas, yes, that I haven't touched upon, and I mean, not with any sort of deliberate thing. I mean, I've sort of touched upon what interested me at a particular time. Not, I think, because I thought any of them were more particularly, important than another. It isn't that I don't think that state power is not important, but that I haven't really seen my way of dealing with it.
Well, yes, that's fine. Now, let me just say, I don't think we want to carry on forever.
We certainly don't. No, we have the cup final. We have the cup final. See.
No, what I want to ask you is really this: where do you think your interests are likely to lead you next? Assuming you're in a position to carry on.
Yes, assuming I'm in a position to carry on. Well, I'm really interested, do you think, in I think what I'd probably be interested in when I finish my flower book, I mean I have one or two other things to deal with, but is that I really probably want to try and sum up, for my own satisfaction, some of the kinds of similarities and differences as I see them between European and Asian societies, partly at the level of culture and knowledge systems generally. In trying to distill something out of Needham's work, Joseph Needham's work and other things. And this touches on what I'm interested in flowers as well as food. Partly looking at aspects of the family as I've done in that book, partly looking at some other, re-looking at some other variables, for example, accounting systems. Some of these things that people have thought made a great difference between European and Asian societies and in their development. It's partly sort of rethinking Weber and the concept of Oriental society. And looking at various aspects of this kind of a contrast. Particularly in the period, say 1800, looking at trying to compare knowledge systems at that time in terms of botanical knowledge and things of this kind. In the two, across these areas. Partly because I feel that that now that we've got these societies developing so rapidly, and I mean, it again goes back to the African problem. Partly because we've got these societies developing into capitalist systems so rapidly in the East, some societies. that I don't see this as a matter of pure imitation. I see it as a matter of building on certain aspects of what was there before.
Right.
Which I don't see as happening in Africa. It's really partly trying to account for that kind of thing, in terms of contributions to knowledge and so forth.
Right, let me just ask right at the end an almost impossible question.
Yes.
Supposing somebody comes to you and says, okay, what have you actually contributed to anthropology? What would you say?
Well, I've contributed at one level that we haven't really discussed, and that's my fieldwork level, and something I've done since I feel proud about, and that is recording an unrecorded myth and editing that and publishing various versions. And having done that at a time when the tape recorder came in, and I was able to, I think, for me anyhow, change my views on mythology at the time. And at that level, I feel I've done something, and one is pleased to be called back to Africa, as we were at December, in order to discuss these matters with locals from the area now. And so it's nice to have done that at the local ethnographic level. And I'm not sure if I haven't had my time again, I wouldn't have spent more time doing that at the local ethnographic level, because of the satisfaction that it brings one. With regard to the other, I hope that I would have made historical facts relevant. Pointed out the relevance for many problems, not all, of historical facts for and notions for anthropological processes, and for the comparison of societies now and in the past. And that one can't lightly overthrow the history of Africa just like that in the course of development. One has to take into account this and build on what is there. But other than that, well, I think I have, in my mind, made, to me, a little sense of the distribution of some historical and sociological data. They may not be entirely correct, I'm sure it can be modified in many ways, but trying to rate things like the existence of adoption and matters of that at the level of kinship, with wider social systems in this kind of regional way,